Hello, it's Hillary from Apothecarian Company in Oxford. So today we're going to talk about the ins and outs of proper supplementation and why it may be important to supplement, what brands you can trust, how to kind of sift through that information. So we'll cover that all today. So first we've got to ask, what's the big deal? Why would we even care? I mean, if you go to a big box store and just pick up a supplement, it should be fine, right? Well, that's not what we are seeing. And we have to kind of wrap all that type of information um, to make the best informed decision. It sounds silly when it comes to supplements. So, what's the big deal? We need to figure out, well, what factors affect vitamin deficiencies that we don't commonly think about? How are we differentiating between good and poor quality supplementation? And then at the end, we will look at the top supplements for women and men alike. But because we talk a lot about hormones here, women in particular. Why should we address this? Well, it's a total body deficiency. And what we found in a 2009 study, and they've done actually repetitive studies in the 2020s, we're seeing that a percentage of the population is found to be deficient. 85% of us are vitamin E deficient, 75% are folate, 70% are calcium, 70 to 90%, and I would dare say magnesium is upwards of 90% deficient. 55% vitamin A, 45% vitamin C, 42% zinc, and then we can think about deficiencies in iron, copper, B12, thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, phosphorus, selenium. And I'm going to add another one in there that I see commonly is just iodine. And we'll talk about that as well. We've got to think about, we're in America, right? We shouldn't be deficient of any of these minerals and vitamins because we should be getting it in our food, but that is not the case. The standard American diet is very um, low in nutrients and low in vitamins, and we will figure out why in a moment. But the government has established this recommended dietary allowance, the RDA, and we'll see that on the back of these nutrition facts and the labels on our food and on our vitamins and on our supplements. But what that means is it's the average daily level of intake sufficient to meet the nutrient requirements of nearly all 97 and 90% healthy people. Awesome statement. I would love that to be true, but we have some faults here. And one of the faults is that these RDAs are from the 1950s. The 1950s are completely different. That's 70 years difference. And they are very outdated. Now, why? Well, our health and our lifestyle has, I would dare say, decreased. We are a more unhealthy society with more compounded health issues. These compounded health issues are requiring even a higher need of vitamins and minerals. So we're eating up all our reserves more so than the 1950s. But we also have to recommend that or recognize that the RDAs only gives us enough to live or sustain life. We are in a world of wellness and nutrition and optimization. And unfortunately, the RDAs do not allow for that. So again, it's just only enough to live or sustain life. If I go one step further, for instance, it provides just enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Scurvy in the United States is not very common anymore. So again, we're looking at 60 milligrams of vitamin C, but if we are adrenally stressed, if we have a lot of immune systems, our body needs vitamin C to help combat that and maintain immunity. So we are automatically already deficient. It Another side thing and where I my interest lies, and it's more from the biochemistry aspect of the body does not give us enough power to exert energy and support the Krebs cycle. That's all our energy reserve. So a lot of people are just overly fatigued. Is this where fibromyalgia is playing a role? Is this where this chronic disease is playing a role? So we just don't have enough to give us what we need nowadays. The other thing that we've got to think about is that our fruits and vegetables do not have enough nutrients in them as they once did, as well as our soil. Overall, it's found to be almost 40% less nutritious than it was in the 1950s. So here our bodies are further burdened and we're eating up all nutrient and vitamin reserves, but we're also seeing that we don't have enough in our fruits and vegetables in our food anymore. So an example, in 100 grams of broccoli in the 50s, we found that there were 130 milligrams of calcium. If we look in the 90s, now that 100 grams of broccoli contains 48 milligrams of calcium. So that's also compounding the problem. So besides food, we have to look at why vitamins may be appropriate for biological pathways, more at a cellular level, right? It's not what's floating around our blood, it's what's being processed down to the nitty-gritty. Our vitamins, for example, are needed to make dopamine and norepinephrine, so our happy fight or flight adrenaline hormones. It is so dependent on vitamin B6, iron, magnesium, folic acid, vitamin C, and even copper. And we just noted that there's a lot of deficiencies in the common population. So, is our mental health um, pandemic at risk because we don't have enough nutrition coming from our food sources? I think so, in part. We need to make serotonin, we need to make melatonin. That's dependent on iron, magnesium, calcium, vitamin B6, folic acid, and zinc again. So if we're deficient in any of these that we're not getting in our diet, specifically magnesium, specifically vitamin Bs, we're not making our serotonin. And if we don't make our serotonin, we're not making our melatonin. So it can adversely affect sleep down certain paths, but that's becoming a problem. Another good example is what something called homocysteine. Homocysteine is an inflammatory biomarker to the cardiovascular system. So it's a 10-year risk predictor for cardiovascular events in the conventional way. But I'm looking at homocysteine as well as looking at detoxification. That's how we process our hormones. That is mental health when we look at folic acid, which we'll talk about in a moment. So homocysteine, we could argue that if you're B12 deficient, if you're folic acid deficient, if you're B6 deficient, you could have a higher risk for cardiovascular issues. So it's very important to look at the big picture and even what it's doing cellularly. Another thing that we can think about is absorption. A lot of times we are in a population, and often because of foods, we can argue, our foods have lost the sense of bitterness. We are eating too much, more processed food. It's a standard American diet that has altered our absorptions. Prescriptions are altering our absorptions. So when we rely on absorption for our vitamins and minerals, we need an increased stomach acid. We need a higher stomach acid, specifically, notoriously, for vitamin D3, B12, and iron. So if your levels of those three vitamins are low, I sometimes think, well, do we have a stomach issue? A stomach acid issue? So we are in a society that loves cutting down stomach acid. Everyone's got heartburn, everyone's got GERD, and we are handing out like candy those medications called proton pump inhibitors, the Nexiums, the omeprazoles, the Prilosec, those types of things. So if you're taking those types of medications, you're decreasing your stomach acid, which could alter absorption of vitamins, which we'll talk about. As you age, your ability to absorb is also declined. And that's because as you age, you actually produce less stomach acid. So it's affecting absorptions of vitamin. And then any sort of GI dysfunctions, if you have any kind of bypass surgeries, if you have Crohn's or irritable bowel, you are likely to have altered absorption issues. So we got to take the big picture, the whole person into consideration. Another thing is, besides absorption, we can also look at, well, maybe you are excreting your vitamins too fast. You don't have the time for them to be processed and used appropriately. So we could have an increased excretion due to if you smoke, if you consume over amounts of alcohol, or if you have a high sugar intake actually as well. We may be not using our vitamins appropriately. So that's a factor. My favorite, being a pharmacist, I am always interested in what prescription medications are causing on the backside. And for these lists, this is the most notorious. So I mentioned that the PPIs, right? The proton pump inhibitors, it is affecting B12 absorption through the mechanism of you don't have enough stomach acid to do that. So there's different mechanisms of why prescription medications will alter our vitamins and nutrient statuses. The other thing besides nutrient absorption and not absorbing vitamins is that we can't make it. It inhibits our nutrient synthesis. And the most common one are the statins and the CoQ10. So if you take any simvastatin or torvastatin or rosuvastatin for cholesterol, we need to be taking a supplement called CoQ10, around 100, maybe even 200 milligrams, depending on other medications you may be taking. But that is the mechanism of, most of the time, just overall fatigue when taking a statin and maybe overall muscle pains and weaknesses. It isn't that the statin has a side effect of those things. Statins don't necessarily cause fatigue. It doesn't necessarily cause muscle weakness, but it's because statins inhibit our body to make what's called CoQ10 needed to make our muscles work appropriately. It's the energy in the cells that our muscles need. So that's a common one. The other thing is alteration of transport across membranes. It's a big one. But the most common thing is there was a medication called Orlistat. It was for weight loss, and what it was doing, it was blocking the absorption of fat in the diet, and then people were losing weight. I think it's kind of old and outdated. We don't use this medication a lot anymore, but when we did, it blocked our absorption of vitamin D. So with that medication, we saw a lot of vitamin D absorption issues. The other thing is increase or decrease metabolism of nutrients. That's done by a different mechanism, and then increase or decrease in excretion of nutrients. So an example of that is if you are on a diuretic, furosemide, hydrochlorothiazide, we know that we need to monitor magnesium and potassium because you are essentially excreting or peeing out those minerals or those electrolytes that we need. And we need to keep an eye on that. So prescription medications are another notorious cause for vitamin deficiencies. Breaking down, and we've done a wonderful job looking at specifics of these types of nutritional deficiencies by what's called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So in 2015 to 16, they occasionally update this survey. We found that 12 to 19-year-olds, 3.7% of these populations were on birth control. Well, if you're on birth control, we know that there's vitamin and nutrition depletions of B vitamins, CoQ10, magnesium, and zinc. 6.2%, and I'm going to dare, this is 10 years information, outdated information. The 12 to 19-year-old range, they're saying 6.2% are on ADD medications. I'm going to argue that that's significantly increased. But ADD medications, methylphenidate, Concertas, Vyvanses, they are notorious for depleting magnesium. Well, what do we find? We find that people with ADD, ADHD are magnesium deficient. primarily. We have a magnesium deficiency overall in the population, and then we add a medication on there, we're becoming more magnesium deficient. There's been ties lately, great studies showing that magnesium deficiency is linked to a higher risk for cognitive issues. Well, and then we're dealing with attention deficit, so it goes hand in hand. 20 to 59-year-olds, we see that 7.5% of the population are on lipid lowering medications, such as the statins. As we just mentioned, CoQ10 plays a huge role. approximately 11 to 12% of the population of 20 to 59-year-olds are on antidepressants. We're watching B vitamins, specifically B6, specifically folate. And what did we talk about earlier? To make those serotonin, to make that dopamine, to make those happy neurotransmitters, we need those B vitamins. So we're kind of we're fighting this balance here. And then for those who are 60 on up, 22.6% are on diabetic drugs, threatening a deficiency in B12 and CoQ10 again. And then it goes on and on. Blood pressure medications deplete magnesium, lipid lowering medications. Now that's a big statistic. 50% of the population 60 and up are on a statin or something lipid lowering. So we call this drug nutrient depletions, and it's a huge topic that I'm passionate about, but something that should be talked about more often. This is an example of that. So if you start, it's a cyclical problem. If we give an individual a birth control, and obviously the medication helps, it prevents a pregnancy, we're doing our job. We know that it depletes vitamin Bs. If it depletes vitamin Bs to a certain extent, a lot of times what we're seeing is that the people who start on birth control, they have a higher risk factor for anxiety. Well, is it because of the vitamin B depletion and they can't make their own serotonin and dopamine? We've got to consider that. But let's just say they have anxiety and the doctor now puts them on an anti-anxiety or an antidepressant to help with that. We have, again, a problem with vitamin B depletion because we're on two medications that alter that. But we'll see that melatonin is now affected because melatonin needs B6 to do its thing. If melatonin is depletion, now someone develops insomnia, and sometimes we can be put on something like Ambien. So this is a perfect example of when you start one medication, 2 drugs come after that, 3 drugs come after that. But it could have been prevented with just simple taking a vitamin B complex. And we've seen it here. It sounds too good to be true, but it does happen. The other thing that we got to consider is polymorphisms, and that's a big word too. But a polymorphism involves 1 or 2 or more variants of a particular DNA sequence. So we call that SNPs. Ways to check that are like the 23andMe, which I don't know they were going bankrupt not too long ago, ancestry.com. So they'll look at your cellular makeup or your DNA makeup, and they will pull this genetic data as it pertains to wellness and nutrition. The most common one that we see out there is what's called the MTHFR gene mutation. Now we recognize that as being a promoter of cardiovascular risk, mental health awareness, things like that. So that's the most common. But what that means is that depending on if you have 1 SNP or 2 SNPs, or even 1 or 2 of these genes, you cannot take dietary folate from vegetables. You cannot take dietary folate from multivitamins and turn it into its most active form. There's a dead stop. You don't have the genetic capability to do that. So that alters what we called that homocysteine value earlier. So we keep an eye on that. But that depends. If you have this MTHFR gene, you will need, when you select your vitamins, multivitamin included, you need to pick out what's called a methylated form. Folate or folic acid will not work. Sometimes it induces anxiety and causes more problems, but we need to pick something what's called methyl a methylated B vitamin. And fitness and athletic training plays a huge role in that too. This will kind of help point out exercise type. It will look at injury risk factors, exercise response. So the 23andMe reports in the ancestry.com also kind of point out the athletic piece of the puzzle too, just as a side note. So given all these informations of why we should really do our due diligence and look in depth at our nutrition in food and in supplementation, how do we go about that? How do we choose the right supplement? So this, we're getting into that right now. So what's our concerns though? We got to kind of build a problem, I would say, around this. So the first question we need to ask ourselves are we getting what the label says? Now, the FDA does a great job at monitoring pharmaceuticals, but it only tests 1% of the 65,000 supplements. There's nobody watching these supplement manufacturers. The FDA just simply can't do that. Knowing a statistic of 50% of Americans take a multivitamin, 1 in 5 take a supplement. So that is a huge amount of the population in which this 1% of tested supplements is going to affect. There is some greed involved. It's $112 billion industry. And with all that being said, it leaves us doing our own research. We have to be the ones responsible for choosing the quality supplementation because no one's going to teach us how to do that and no one's looking out for us. We do find a lot of counterfeits out there that this kind of goes and pushed under the rug, but there was a Forbes study, and what they found is that Amazon and eBay, 25% of the supplementation out there or vitamins that are on that market is a Chinese counterfeit. If it is an unbelievable low price, the World Customs Organization has deemed it possible dangerous. It could be useless, expired, or bad, that is repackaged as new, and it could be stolen on the black market. So we've got to do our research, right? These organizations have kind of set standards out there, but again, because this industry is so huge, there's no good regulation. And it could be harmful. Besides being dangerous and expired or stolen on the black market, we've got to look into and make sure that there's no heavy metal particulates in there. And then we need to look at the inactive ingredients. So that we have to take into consideration. What about quality? We've got to think about shipping and handling regulations, right? So as pharmaceuticals come into the pharmacy, I need to know the chain where it's coming from. It's coming from the bulk ingredient manufacturer, and then there's certain things that have to go on and testing to get to the manufacturers of the pharmaceuticals themselves, and then it's got to go to the warehouses. So there's a strict chain of command or chain of events that happen in the pharmaceutical world. No one's doing this with the supplementation. So when you get that probiotic, is it being refrigerated? Is the Amazon warehouse storing it in refrigeration? There's no cold chains that we can check on. Where is it from manufacturer consumer? When you get it from Amazon and it's sitting, or even in UPS, is it sitting in their trucks? Thereby using the probiotic is going to be useless because it is now baked and not, appropriately chilled and stored in refrigeration. So we've got to talk about that. No, if it's exposed to heat and it's sitting in warehouses, there are incidences of things sitting on shelves for 6 weeks. Well, now you're taking a probiotic that you think is working, but it may be not working. So we have to consider how many change of hands has occurred during this process. We want to make sure that it has an expiration date, not a manufacturer date. So if something has a manufacturer date, I know when it's manufactured, but this company has not done the due diligence and making sure that it's good past this amount of date. So it's just transparency and more integrity. And then we have to take in consideration strict retail or resale contracts. Many online retailers are selling you supplements illegally. We'll talk about that in a moment. And a lot of these companies that are regulating strict pharmaceutical practices when doing their supplementation, when providing supplementation, they have departments who specifically investigate illegal reselling. So there are, and a lot of these things are more of the professional brands of supplements. In 2015, the Office of the New York Attorney General found that close to 80% of the supplements at 4 major retails did not meet label claim and were mislabeled under federal regulation. So even the states are recognizing this. Warnings issued by the FDA from 2007 to 2016 show that nearly 800 dietary supplements contain unimproved ingredients, 98% which were not declared on the label, 20% contain more than one illegal ingredient. So it is, and this is a problem. I mean, this is published in the Journal American Medical Association. Points to consider when selecting your supplementation, just kind of what we use here as standard. We want to go by USP. That's the United States Pharmacopoeia. And they are an independent organization that comes in and they verify potency and expiration. So these supplement companies open their doors and say, yes, USP, come in and test my product, because they have to be under the same standards that a pharmaceutical medication has to abide by. So very, very strict. And a lot of these companies, besides what we carry here, out there, Nature Made is one of them, Kirkland from Costco, will have this USP label. So that is something that we look for. The other thing is, are they using good manufacturing practices? So the FDA regulates and assures the identity, strength, quality, and purity of drug products by requiring that manufacturers of medications and supplementations, if they open their doors to, adequately control all operations. So they will say this is done by good manufacturing practices, so GMP. So that could be found on the label. We also want to consider the location of the manufacturer, right? There are a lot of manufacturers that are in the United States. In fact, our product line is manufactured in Wisconsin. So being stateside matters. And then another thing is consumer lab independent testing. Some of these manufacturers will have own verifications in their lab, and they disclose that, and they are well willing to give you a certificate of analysis. Some of them send that off and still share the certificate of analysis. So transparency is key in that. We want to make sure that when we look at these, we want reputable companies, no pharmaceutical companies or big corporations that have biased information. So we're looking for reputable companies, and we're also looking for companies that use scientific evidence as part of their formulations and ingredients and therapeutic amounts. Perfect example is vitamin patches. As a pharmacist, I know of no patch, no absorption of vitamins that go through the skin transdermally. I'm sure there are, but the point is, I reached out to one of these companies because they wanted me to carry their vitamin patches. I reached out and said, where is your scientific evidence showing me that there is absorption and that we're seeing it in blood levels and we're seeing side effect? I wanted the whole kit and caboodle. I wanted enough evidence, as we have with pharmaceuticals, to show me that it was safe and that it's going to do its job. And they weren't able to provide me with anything. So again, it's very important that we want to choose companies that use scientific evidence to make their product. When we look at vitamins, we're also looking at excipients. We want to know what binders, what fillers they are using. When we do our compound here, we often just use one filler. We're just using something called cellulose. Sometimes we use silica. Sometimes we use clean products. My point is, if you look at, and I'm just going to say women's one a day, if you look at their excipients in their binders and what makes up that tablet, there are almost 10 of those. So my argument would be, and I think we'll see this in a second, my argument would be is how can your body break down something that is so packed full of something? Excipients that does not need to be there. So excipients play a huge role. I just want a few. I don't want a lot. Why are they including dyes? Dyes, they'll put, red dyes, they'll put blue dye in there. Unnecessary. So we go for the dye free. We're looking at binders. That's kind of the same thing as excipients. What about therapeutic values? If I'm going to use, and this is where I stay in the case of multivitamins. Why am I going to take a multivitamin that's producing 60 milligrams of vitamin C, for example, that's going to be enough to prevent scurvy in the 1950s, and not go higher milligrams? So I'm looking, to be honest, I'm looking for 100% RDA. I'm looking for 1,000% RDA. You need to do the research to see the therapeutic amount you need. For instance, vitamin Bs, 1 milligram of vitamin B is not going to produce enough serotonin, right? I'm looking for 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, and that's where it takes a skilled person to have that conversation with, right? It isn't something just willy-nilly and more is best. That's not the case. We're looking at integrity of the brand. As I just said, transparency. Are they doing good manufacturing practices? Are they opening their doors to be audited? Are they using synthetic forms of vitamins, right? So I mentioned Nature's Made earlier. Nature Made is a wonderful company. They stand by their products. They're accurate within that USP regulation. But the thing is, if I pull a magnesium off the shelf, their magnesium is going to be magnesium oxide. It's subpar absorption. 6% of magnesium oxides absorbed. So sometimes they'll use synthetic forms of vitamins. Sometimes they'll use not absorbable forms of vitamins. So it takes that extra guess. And then I mentioned salt forms. Citrate, carbonate, malate, gluconate, glycinate. You'll see all these types of salt forms. There's going to be some people that need chelated forms. So that often there's certain different salt forms that are better absorbed. So it takes a bigger picture than just one size fits all. We did have a couple bit of studies, and I'm all about evidence-based. So there was studies found in the Journal of American Medical Association in 2013, and it was entitled "Over-the-Counter and Compounded Vitamin D: Is Potency What We Expect?" So what they did is they took 15 sealed bottles from different companies. They sampled 5 tabs. They did different lots, same lots, and what they found is that it varied from 9 to 140%, 146% of the expected dose. All USP verified manufacturers, they were almost 101% accurate. Spot on. That's where we should be. But some of them had, with the vitamin D 1,000 units, some of them had 500 units, some of them had 1,300 units. Some argue that there are no safety concerns, which is true, right? Vitamin D3, 1,000 units are very forgiving. But when we need to tailor a dose to pediatrics, when we need to tailor a dose to a therapeutic amount, it's going to make a difference. So in this particular article, looking at vitamin D3 1,000, it's not going to have a safety concern, but that's just vitamin D. There's several different other supplements out there. They did the same thing with melatonin in 2017. There was 83 to 478% of the expected dose. 26% of those had added serotonin in the bottle without listing it. So again, rule of thumb, USP verification is key unless you're going with a professional supplement company. Examples of trusted brands. There's a lot of them, and the brands that I carry in the store, most of them, you have to have a medical license professional to carry that. So there's orthomolecular, there's metagenics, which metagenics now you can get on Amazon conveniently. There is our brand, Apothecary Company brand. We go through strict standards and strict testing, just as I just talked about, to make sure everything is spot on. Um, Most companies, a lot of these companies are they're spending $3.5 million annually on quality testing. They have a tightly controlled supply and distribution chain. We've got a certificate of analysis on all products. So before that goes out the door, they know that they're, within that limit of the USP guidelines. The raw materials are tested. If we've got some companies that if they get a raw material problem, orthomolecular being one of them, they brought in fiber not too long ago, and they did not, it didn't past their quality control standards. They sent that back, and their product was unavailable for 6 months until they found a different manufacturer. So raw material tests are important. Third-party assays, a lot of these that we carry, we are working with a population that is sensitive to a lot of things. There's gluten-free testing. There are dairy allergies. There's allergen-free excipients. There's label transparency, so we don't want any GMOs, no artificial sweeteners. We want to use natural colors. We want to use vegetarian products and capsules. So all this is part of their integrity. Other thoughts, we can go on to just the expansion of wellness and nutrition. There's a lot of tests out there that look at vitamin deficiency. There's blood tests, there's urine tests. So if there's ever a question for you, we are here to help. We have the access to these, and we could tell you, the most where cost effective route. The other resources I'd like to point out is the Linus Pauling Institute. It is run by, I believe, the University of Oregon or University of Washington. And within that, they have the Linus Pauling Institute. If you go on their website, they will talk about all these vitamins, all the nutrition, what you may be finding in dietary sources nowadays. What is the recommended amount? Why is it so important? So it's a wonderful resource. The other thing is I've been talking about the USP a lot. United States Pharmacopoeia, their website's usp.org. Looking into the 5 top supplements that I mentioned earlier that are very important in just overall health is the first one being omega-3. There's EPA, DHA. Omega-3s are typically we think about fish oil, right? But EPA, DHA are found in chia seeds, it's found in flax seeds, it's found in algae. But why do we want to consider that? Why would someone be on an omega-3? Well, we know that there's heart and blood vessel protection. It's wonderful at reducing triglycerides. It's good anti-inflammatory for joints. It optimizes brain health, specifically more of the DHA side. But we've also seen in clinical studies showing that there's been an increase or an improvement in depression and anxiety scores. So there's a correlation there. When we're finding omega-3s, we need to look for the absorbable form. Everyone's like, is it going to cause me fish burps? Is it going to cause me to just have an upset stomach? Is it going to stink? A good form should not have to be refrigerated, and you should not burp up. If you do that, it's because of the quality of the omega-3 itself and the way that they're manufacturing that. How much of omega-3 should you have? It depends. I will say that omega-3s, anything above the 1.8 gram per day mark will act as an anti-inflammatory. So we see a lot of benefits in overall aches and pains with a dosage of 1.8 grams or more. Works on the same pathway as, say, Motrin and Aleve. We do want to have caution of blood thinning. That is a potential problem down the road, but it does take a significant amount of omega-3s to do that. And then conveniently for the vegans or people who are allergic to fish, the algae form is available. B vitamins. Why would we want to take any B vitamins? Well, we know and we've talked about that it's necessary for energy production, right? We need it for energy. It does by decreasing homocysteine, it reduces cardiovascular risk. It's the cofactors needed for serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, all these neuro happy transmitters. So B vitamins are very important for that. They are water soluble, so the chances of overdosing on B vitamins are very low. It will be likely that it will be eliminated through your urine if that is the case. And then again, we talked about how genetics play a role. Do we need a super absorbable form, methylated versus non-methylated, just because of your genetics? So B vitamins, I think, are very important, specifically in the population of people taking the antidepressants, people with anxiety, people who can't sleep, people who are taking hormones, birth control, that type of population. Magnesium is my major go-to, and I'm going to tell you that there's no amount of multivitamin that's going to provide enough magnesium for your recommended daily allowance. So the RDA in magnesium is 300 to 400 milligrams a day. We are not getting that in our food. That's what we need from the 1950s. And that burden, I'm going to say, is even so much more now. So magnesium is something that I feel most people should supplement with. So 3/4 of the population do have magnesium deficiency. I mentioned that magnesium oxide provides no absorption, only 6%. Most people think they're getting a benefit of it, and they are absolutely not. It may provide benefit at going to the bathroom and providing good bowel movements, but you're not getting the benefit of cardiovascular help, liver help. Magnesium is needed for so many things. I can say that the chelated mineral absorption is better, usually 8.8 times greater absorption. So sometimes you'll see a chelated magnesium. My favorite form other than a chelated is magnesium glycinate. There is magnesium threonate out there that's good for cognition, but know that magnesium threonate is about 2 to 3 times as much cost as just regular magnesium, and sometimes that cost is not going to be any better systemically on how you feel. Magnesium is used. We'll see magnesium deficiency in people with fatigue, muscle cramps, headaches, migraines are huge. People with migraines are often magnesium deficient. People who can't sleep, magnesium, when we suggest taking it, we say take it at bedtime because it does help promote rest and relaxation. People will see an improvement in sleep. We need it for our immune system. We need it for irregular heartbeats. We need it for high blood pressure. So magnesium is so important. Vitamin D, specifically vitamin D3. Vitamin D is needed for many things, including thyroid regulation, blood clotting. It helps rebuild a gut lining, cancer protection, immune system, developing and maintaining healthy bones. I personally think vitamin D is more important than calcium and osteoporosis, osteopenia. So vitamin D is huge, but I'm also going to say, please do not depend on vitamin D through the sun. Vitamin D through the sun is very important in how we process dietary vitamin D through the liver, but I cannot depend on vitamin D coming from the sun. COVID studies have shown that most people who do not take vitamin D are deficient. Vitamin D is very important to check blood work, I believe, every year. We want levels anywhere 50 to, like, in general, 50 to 70 If you not take vitamin D a day, at least 5,000 units, you are likely deficient. If you are deficient, we're going to see an increased risk for hair loss, mood, slow wound healing, bone growth problems, fatigue, chronic pain, infertility, blood pressure issues, a lot of things. So vitamin D is very important. It also helps absorb calcium along with vitamin K to help bone health. And it is very fat soluble. So we do generally recommend to get your levels checked at least once a year. Probiotics, plus or minus, we'll just say if people are struggling with gut issues, bloating, chronic constipation, maybe wavering with diarrhea, probiotics are something to consider. Some of these people who are on antibiotics, anyone on an antibiotic, either maybe even for acne or just an illness, should be on a probiotic to help benefit the gut while going through that transition. So probiotic, they're good bacteria in your gut. They help synthesize vitamin K in the body. They help produce vitamin B vitamins. Your body needs a good microbiome in the gut to produce your serotonin. 80%, I can argue maybe even 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut, and it needs a good bacteria to help that out. I think that covers a lot. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming, but I want to thank you for watching. We do, as I mentioned, we do have a vitamin line ourselves, supplement line through apothecariandcompany.com. If that's something that interests you, I do have a discount code on the bottom, the CU15 for 15% off. But please reach out if you have any questions, and I thank you.